Okay, I guess we can start. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to this webinar entitled 2024 EU Elections and Beyond: Civil Society and Think Tanks on the Future on Environmental Transition. The aim of this webinar is, with the EU 2024 elections just around the corner, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP, is organizing this webinar on the future of the environmental transition and the next phase of the European Green Deal, especially on the relationship between the European and national policies. We are collaborating with a number of our esteemed colleagues, with other think tanks, Jacques Delors Centre and I3G, and civil society organizations, CAN Europe, on behalf of an alliance of climate and environmental NGOs focusing on the 2024 EU elections. We have today with us speakers from these different organizations who will present their latest tools and analysis to evaluate the ways the political parties are conceiving, communicating, and producing policies related to the environmental and climate transition related to the European Green Deal. This webinar is aiming at examining how the EGD's legislative and political framework will be shaped by a new European Parliament and a new College of Commissioners, as well by the European Council's strategic agenda. Without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful speakers that are with us this afternoon. Joe Inwood is the EU elections campaign officer at CAN Europe, who will be presenting the EU Parliament Scoreboard of 2024. We have Irene Chiocchetti, policy officer at IEEP, who will be presenting the final report of the EGD Barometer 2024. We have Pepe Escrig, researcher at I3G, who will be presenting the EU election manifestos and climate action, and Jannik Jansen, who is policy fellow at the Jacques Delors Centre, who will be presenting a survey on debunking the myth of green backlash. Before I give them the floor, though, let me just remind everyone of a couple of house rules, very quickly, I promise. So this is a Zoom webinar, which will be recorded, and IEP will be live tweeting. So you are all invited to interact via that social media channel. The PowerPoint presentations that have been prepared and who will be shared today by the presenters will be shared with the wider audience after the meeting. If you want to interact, please present yourself, identify yourself and your organization, and please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, since we have a number of audience present here today, and we would like to give everyone the chance to interact and pose their questions to the speakers or to the different interventions. Please use the Q&A button rather than the chat of live interaction, which we might have issues monitoring. Last but not least, we will be sharing polls during the presentation. We will ask your contribution via Zoom polls. So please don't be surprised if you see pop-up windows and questions being asked. That is perfectly normal. Without further ado, as I was saying, if I can give the floor to Joe from CAN Europe, presenting the EU Parliament Scoreboard in 2024. Joe, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Antoine, and thanks to the IEP for convening this discussion today. And it's great to see so many people connected. It's really exciting. I believe the poll will launch now, right? So maybe you can already see it. But it relates to the presentation that I'm about to make. In order to answer this poll, you also maybe need a little bit of context on what we're talking about. But I'm about to present CAN Europe's EU Parliament Scoreboard, which was developed together with this alliance of NGOs focusing on environmental and climate action in the elections. And the first question asks you, what percentage of MEPs do you think were classed as prehistoric thinkers? So this was the worst performing category of MEPs over the last 5 years, with a score of less than 40 out of 100. And the second question is about the national political parties that make up the groups in the parliament. And it asks, the average score for the Renew Europe group was 56 out of 100, but which party had the lowest score within that group? Because indeed, as with many of these groups, there's a wide range of scores even within these groupings. So I let the votes come in, and then I guess we will see the result.
Yeah, people are still voting, so I'll give them a couple more seconds.
And I hope this helps to also break the ice and get everyone warmed up. And I'm interested to know if you've heard of these three parties, if you're not from Czechia, Sweden, or Germany. Perhaps the FDP you might have, but not to give any clues.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll here, and I'm going to share the results with you. Can you see them, Joe?
I actually can't see the results, but I trust that everyone else can.
Can you see them, Antoine?
We can see the questions again, but not the result.
Ah, okay.
Suzanne, you can see the results.
I can. Yeah. I can actually, so I'll quickly read them out. So for the first question, it was, let me see, 48% people got the right answer. And do you remember the answer of the question, Joe? I'm not really familiar with this. So it was 48%.
Yes, the correct answer was 48%, indeed. So almost half.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super. And 42 people got the correct answer there. And then for the second question, the correct answer was Czechia. And how many people? 42 again. So that 42% of people attending this, they know their facts.
That's very impressive results, and it's a good sign, I think, for the attendees today, speaking to an audience of think tanks, researchers, and it's really great to see. So indeed, I will begin the presentation of this scoreboard. And thanks again to IEP for convening us. So first of all, Climate Action Network Europe, in case you're not familiar with us, so we're a civil society network, as you may know. We have 200 member organizations across Europe, including the IEP and E3G. So think tanks play a really important role in informing the kind of expertise in the network, informing a lot of our advocacy. And we are, of course, the European regional node of CAN International, which is a worldwide network of climate-focused NGOs. So I'll start with looking back a little bit, because I think you're going to hear later on from colleagues about the potential kind of backlash to the Green Deal. You're going to hear some, I think, apprehension in the Barometer among the future of the Green Deal, and you're also going to hear a kind of detailed analysis of the manifestos and what's to come potentially in the next 5 years. So it might seem a little bit strange to start with a backwards look on the record of MEPs over the last 5 years, but we think it's important to do this because this is an election campaign, and as the election campaign officer for CAN Europe, part of my role has been about communicating to our member organizations, but then more broadly to citizens about which MEPs and which parties and groups have been strong defenders of climate action over the last 5 years, and to kind of cut through the rhetoric and see actually whose voting record matches the kind of promises that were being made. So this is something that we developed also in 2019. And if you might remember, during that election campaign, these dinosaurs, snails, and superheroes. So this was a kind of colorful way of communicating to people about how the political groups performed during the 2014 to 2019 parliament, which was a very different kind of parliament actually to the 2019 to 24 parliament. So there was no Green Deal. But during this period, we analyzed specifically their voting performance on climate and energy files mostly. And this was quite some success. It received a lot of coverage. And we also collected some really useful data, actually. So this was really the inspiration for what we've done this time round, where we've gone a step further. So in 2024, we developed this scoreboard jointly, together with the European Environmental Bureau, together with BirdLife Europe Transport and Environment, and the WWF European Policy Office. So this allowed us to kind of broaden the breadth of policy expertise that we could feed into analyzing the votes. And as a result, we came up with these 3 pillars of the scoreboard. So the first is on climate neutral and socially just transition. The second on nature positive, looking at biodiversity. And the third being on pollution and circular economy. So really spanning across European Green Deal files and beyond, actually, because we didn't want to be too narrow just thinking about the Green Deal. We also wanted to kind of bring in the range of focuses across the work that we have, including international, on trade, and so on. So in the end, we had 30 policy files that we selected for analysis. So most of these are important for the European Green Deal, like I was saying, but they also bring in this kind of specific expertise of the 5 organizations involved in developing the scoreboard. The other important criteria was availability of data. So we needed to make sure that this was publicly accessible and easy to read and to then kind of analyze in a fair way. And then we selected within these 30 files 124 different individual votes, sometimes on specific amendments, but also sometimes on the final text in the Parliament. But these were always roll call plenary votes. So every member of the European Parliament had an opportunity to vote in these votes. So we could treat them all fairly. And we also looked at, where was the ambition opportunities? Where were they able to vote for the kind of action that we need to see before going into the trilogue negotiations? So this always gave MEPs the opportunity to match our priorities, actually, as civil society, and vote in line with our recommendations. So the MEPs that voted in line with our recommendations always got 100 out of 100 for each of those individual votes. But those 30 policy files are weighted equally in terms of calculating the outcome. So these were the 30 files. There were 12 in the climate and just transition pillar. And you can see some really key legislation there regarding Fit for 55, for example, but also the Refuel EU package, the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Social Climate Fund. So really looking not just at climate ambition, but also at the just and the kind of fairness aspect of these files too. And also this union list of projects of common interest, which was to do with fossil gas and the role of fossil gas going forward in our energy mix. On nature, there were 8 files there, slightly fewer, and I think that reflects also the relative lack of new legislation around nature, perhaps compared to other areas during the last 5 years. But of course, the nature restoration law is analysed, as well as the common agriculture policy. And then in the final pillar, you have the pollution and circular economy files. And here you have things like the Critical Raw Materials Act, so also files with an international dimension beyond just Europe, but also really important legislation around pollution, health, the mercury regulation, for example, and the ambient air quality directives. So all in all, quite a comprehensive assessment. And that's why the score for each of these 30 individual files was then aggregated to give us scores out of 100 for every political group in the parliament and also for every national party. So all that to say, we can be quite confident then in the comprehensive nature of these results, which is why we were confident then to classify them into these 3 categories. So here you can see the overall results for the entire parliament over the last 5 years, and you can see the score here for each of the groups overall. That's kind of the big number that's highlighted. So overall, we saw that the protectors, and that's groups that score 70 and above, so in kind of the top 30 percentage scores, were the Greens, the Left, and the S&D, although the S&D only just, and we'll come to that in a minute. You had the middling group, which is between 40 and 70, and that was Renew Europe with a score of 56 out of 100. And then you had the bottom 3 groups with the lowest scores overall, and these were the prehistoric thinkers. So these were the groups that were not just too slow, but also sometimes actively obstructing some of this legislation in the parliament. And this was the EPP with a score of 25 out of 100, the ECR and the ID with even lower scores, and the ID with a really shockingly low score of just 6 out of 100. So this is kind of the bigger picture. And perhaps you'd say there's no surprises in here. This already reflects what you kind of already know. I would encourage you to look at the scoreboard yourself through the interactive tool that we developed, because here you can see results for each of those 30 files. And there's a really rich source of data, I think, that you can draw on to see for each of these legislative files, how did the parties in my country perhaps, and how did they vote? And what did they stand up for, and where were they weaker and where were they stronger? So, I mean, we still have quite some days left before votes begin to be cast. There are many debates happening in different countries across Europe. And if you want to use this perhaps as a kind of fact-checking tool, when candidates make certain claims, then you'll be able to go back and see, did they vote in line with the recommendations that we put forward as civil society? And also, will they next time, to be more forward-looking, perhaps they can upgrade themselves from snails to superheroes. I will run quite briefly then actually through the more detailed results pillar by pillar, because I think it's worth just zooming in on some of them. So for example, you'll see here the results highlighted on climate and just transition. And you'll see here that actually the S&D group, for example, drops below a little bit into the procrastinator territory with a score of 67. But then for other groups, this was the relatively stronger score. For example, for Renew, this was actually higher than the other two scores for the other two pillars. But I think this kind of gives the sense of maybe where some of the gaps have been in the parties and the group's performances. With the case of S&D, for example, on some of those transport-related files that I mentioned before. On nature, there's no surprises here that the ID group, but also the EPP, the European People's Party, go below their average. So the score for the EPP was really, really low on nature, only 19 out of 100, so lower than their average. And this is something that's quite concerning, of course. You can see actually higher than average scores for some of the stronger performing groups on nature. But this is just some more kind of data that we thought was worth highlighting. And then finally on pollution and circular economy, the EPP redeems itself slightly. I mean, still only 30 out of 100, but a relatively stronger score than some of their score on the other pillars. But then we see some slight dips as well for the other groups. You can go more granular than this by looking through the results on the widgets that I showed before. So there's overall, I mean, as you can see, there's a mixed picture on climate ambition, right? So there were MEPs who did make a serious effort to secure this socially just transition that we need. And you can find them in groups on the left, in the center, and also on the center right. So you can actually look in the results and break down within the EPP group, for example, which were the parties that actually did step up and have a higher score. And there are, a minority of those on the center right that I think will potentially be even more important in the next parliament, and we could come to that later. But the conclusion broadly is that only a minority of MEPs, mostly in the Greens and the left, really voted to fully unlock all the benefits of the transition for all of society and really kind of bring this just transition to a reality. And then there's the kind of stark fact that if we want to keep the 1.5 degree target from the Paris Agreement attainable, the next parliament really needs to support an acceleration of climate action rather than a pause. So we need to see really urgent climate action still this decade. And that, of course, can only come from the protectors. We hope to see more protectors in the next parliament. So the overall conclusions, there are some really big gaps between what citizens actually prioritize and then how their parties and MEPs have represented them in the parliament. We know that from the Eurobarometer that citizens do have strong interest in continuous climate action, and you'll hear more on that from one of the other speakers later. And of course, this needs to be a priority for the next parliament. So we need to mobilize people to vote. We need to mobilize them for a climate neutral future for Europe. And then in the next mandate, we expect the protectors in all the groups to step up. Finally, just a bit of inspiration. If you are working for a civil society organization, you're involved in campaigning at national level, all of this is available in every national language of the EU. So you can see here in Slovenia, in France, in the Netherlands, and in Germany. This is all being put to good use in terms of the campaign in these critical last days before people start to vote. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Joe, for this presentation. And I really would like to emphasize the idea that irrelevant of your own political preference, these particular tools that you've presented allow you to get the information at the very granular level to see how your MEP has been voting, how this aligns with your own political preferences and priorities, and now allow you to eventually make a better informed choice in the EU election. And I think that's a very, very crucial tool at our disposal at the moment. So thank you very much, Joe, for this presentation. Again, I repeat that the presentation shared by the speaker and the general information that is presented today will be shared to all participants after the meeting. So you will have access to everything. And without further ado, let me pass on the floor then now to our own Irene Chiocchetti, Policy Officer at IEEP, for her presentation of the final report on the European Green Deal Barometer 2024. Irene, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Antoine. I'm going to share my slides. Okay, you see the presentation mode, right? Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm going to present some of the results of the European Green Deal Barometer, which is an annual expert consultation that aims to assess the progress of implementation of the Green Deal. IEP builds it every year together with other survey partners ranging from the Think Sustainable Europe's network of think tank, the Think 2030 platform, and beyond. This year's edition has a special focus on the EU elections, measuring its resilience in the aftermath of the elections, and also makes an overall assessment of the implementation progress in all the Green Deal's areas. We have some national cases, deep diving into the national situations, and we usually select member states that are linked to the presidency of the Council of the EU. So this year we have France, Czechia, Sweden, Spain, and Poland. And since last year, we decided to include also the external dimension of the Green Deal and measure its impact and influence on third countries. So this year we have interviewed more than 300 experts, having different backgrounds, but many years of experience in the sustainability sector. I will first start with a poll for you that then I will compare with the actual results of the barometer. So you should be able to see it soon. Yes, so in your view, will the 2024 EU election have a positive, negative, or neutral impact on the implementation of the European Green Deal? A few more moments to vote. Let me know when it's done, please.
You're at 70% now, so it's just waiting for a couple more, but I think I can end it. Do you see the results, Irene?
No, not yet. Okay, now I can see.
Perfect.
And yeah, 68% of participants believe that the elections will have a negative impact, which is actually reflected. Oh, it's not. Yeah, on the results of the Green Deal Barometer, with almost about 2/3 of experts believing that the EU elections will have a negative impact. They also believe that expect that the EGD agenda will be narrowed or weakened, with only a very small proportion believing that it will be kept as it is or strengthened and broadened. And this is probably due to the polls that have been circulating for a while now, seeing a new parliament leaning towards more conservative and climate skeptic groups. I have another question, and this one has a more long-term view. There you go. So if you think that in the long term, the new institutions will turn the Green Deal's ambitions into legislation, helping the achievement of climate neutrality.
Okay, I'm going to end it there. To share the results.
Great. So here, yeah, well balanced, but a bit different from the Barometer's results, because despite the EU election threatening the implementation of the Green Deal, there is still a certain confidence on the Green Deal's objectives to be turned into legislation. So even in face of political shifts in the long term, EU experts continue to believe that the European institutions will enact the European Green Deal, which of course gives some optimism for the future and for the achievement of the climate objectives. Indeed, we also asked what are the main opportunities resulting from the European Green Deal being approved into legislation, and climate mitigation and adaptation is considered to be the main opportunity. And this was a finding that we had also in the previous edition, meaning that addressing climate change and tackling the climate crisis remains the most valued result of implementing the Green Deal. On the other hand, we have asked experts what is the main obstacle to the implementation of the Green Deal, and it appeared that insufficient commitment by member states is the greatest barriers. And again, this is a repeated trend that we had at least in the past 3 editions of the Barometer. I also wanted to highlight that we included the upcoming EU elections among the tested barriers, and they are ranked only in the 5th place. So which means that, yes, they are seen as a threat to the European Green Deal, but if assessed together with other barriers, there are other issues that are more of concerns, rather linked to member states' attitude and to other problems such as inflation and rising cost of living. So this is also makes us think that the Green Deal might even overcome the election challenge. We then asked experts what actors are important for the continuation of the Green Deal, and among the institutions, the Commission is seen as crucial for the continuation of the Green Deal, being the only institutions holding the right of legislative initiative. Then also the European Parliament, the Council of the EU, and the European Councils are considered to be very important, with the latter being the one outlining the priorities for the next mandate in the European Strategic Agenda. We asked the same question, but for other kind of stakeholders, and large-scale businesses, national parliaments, European citizens, and civil society organizations and movements are considered to be very important for the continuation of the Green Deal, suggesting that they should also be involved throughout the process, even in the next phase of legislature. Now, looking at the national case studies, which cover France, Czechia, Sweden, Spain, and Poland, we have asked national experts whether they believe their national government will continue to commit to the Green Deal after the EU elections. And this map shows that this is the general belief in all of these countries with different percentages, but very good news from, results from Spain and Poland with the new government, believing that their governments will continue to commit. Also, France is quite positive than Sweden, and Czechia is a bit lower, but still have of respondents believe that their government will continue to commit to the Green Deal agenda. In this table, I have put together some more results regarding the 5 case studies that can be compared. For example, we asked the stakeholder what stakeholder drives most progress towards the Green Deal at national level. And as you can see, civil society organizations and academia and university are the stakeholders driving most progress in this country. On the other hand, we have more varied results regarding the biggest barriers to the implementation of the Green Deal. For France, for example, is the inflation and the rising cost of living. In Czechia is lack of consensus across the political spectrum. In Sweden and in Poland is short-term thinking by decision makers. And in Spain, it's rather linked to the private sector and the increases cost of doing business. We have also asked which area the EU should focus on to increase support for the Green Deal at national level. And for 4 countries out of 5, most experts selected ensuring a socially just transition. So, which also appeared in the priorities that the Commission should have on the agenda for the next mandate. For France, on the other hand, the most voted policy area was a fair and sustainable food and farming system, which actually was also one of the top 2 priorities for the next Commission. Last but not least, I have a few more findings on the external impact of the Green Deal. This year we have interviewed 36 experts from outside the EU, 17 are still from European countries, and 19 from the rest of the world. And the objective of this section is to understand whether the Green Deal's target will help the EU to achieve the international climate objectives, to understand what problems and opportunities the Green Deal poses to third countries, and whether the Green Deal will inspire other countries to increase action to address climate and environmental challenges. And the first question that we asked, however, was to test the familiarity of the Green Deal to non-EU experts. And as you can see, 61% declares to be very or quite familiar with the Green Deal policies, which is a data that increased compared to last year's edition, where it was only half of the non-EU experts interviewed declared to be familiar. Now I have one last poll to ask you regarding the external impact of the Green Deal, and it's basically to see whether you agree on the fact that the Green Deal will have an impact on a global scale if implemented, when implemented. Oh, wow. Yeah, it's almost unanimity. No one is disagreeing with this statement. And it's, yeah, actually also what came up during our survey. So 94% of the experts interviewed agree on the fact that the Green Deal will have a global impact. They also tend to agree that the Green Deal will help the EU to implement certain international targets, for example, those of the Paris Agreement, the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework's objectives, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. They also agree on the fact that the Green Deal helps the EU to establish as a leader in addressing global environmental challenges, and even if with a slightly lower percentage, they still agree on the fact that the Green Deal inspire their countries to increase the ambition in their action in tackling environment and climate challenges. So this was the last slide from me. I'm looking forward to the discussion after the other presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irene, for your presentation of the Barometer. That's really the fourth iteration of the Barometer. So it starts now to tell us a trend rather than a one-time picture. And I find it quite interesting, this alignment or misalignment between these questions that we've asked to sustainability experts and that we've asked to you today. For instance, on the potential impacts of the election on the European Green Deal, we see a very strong alignment. I think it was 67% in the poll and 68% in the Barometer. So I think we can all agree on the risk that these elections might entail on the European Green Deal. But then when we look at the resilience, potential resilience of the European Green Deal to this sort of to this result, then somewhat the picture is a bit bleaker today. The answers by the experts were slightly more positive toward the potential resilience of the European Green Deal. So is it because the picture has changed in the past few months, in the time when we asked this question to the experts and today? Or perhaps is it because the experts are more confident, actually the sustainability experts are more confident on the capacity of the European Green Deal to be resilient? But these are very interesting findings. So thank you very much, Irene and everyone. Next, may I ask to Pepe Escrig to take on the floor, or researcher at the E3G, to present the election manifestos and climate action analysis that you've done. Pepe, you have the floor. You're on mute.
Now, I hope you can hear me properly. So thank you, first of all, to IEEP for organizing this event and for inviting us. And also, thank you to Can Europe and Jacques Delors Centre, not Institute, for also taking part of this and making it possible. So yeah, as Antoine was saying, I'm a researcher of EU politics at E3G, which stands for Third Generation Environmentalism. We're a climate change think tank with offices here in Brussels, but also in London, Berlin, and Washington, DC. And we our mission is to tackle the barriers and advance the solutions to a safe climate for all. So what I will be doing today is, first of all, give a bit of context to present the analysis that we have carried out. So how the EU's future agenda is shaping up, and what are exactly the EU election manifestos and why they matter when we think about what we can expect from the next European Parliament, and then we will delve deeper into that analysis of the political manifestos. So on the context, yeah, basically the main thing I want to say here is that the EU elections will shape the political demands that the new parliamentary majority formed by the enough political groups that that will have a majority in the European Parliament will put on the table for endorsing the future EU Commission President, and therefore the political priorities of the European parties during the campaign are very relevant because they will determine what these groups prioritize as well. Then, of course, this is not the only thing that we should bear in mind when we think about the future policy priorities of the EU. The strategic agenda of EU leaders at the European Council is also very relevant. So we can expect kind of a balance of both things. So on the EU election manifestos specifically, perhaps many of you already know what they are and you're familiar, but maybe others aren't. So they are documents that outline the vision of each political party at the EU level for the future of the EU in the next 5 years. They are not exactly a list of policy asks, but rather a high-level vision of where the EU needs to go. They are not binding, and I think that's also important to bear in mind. But of course, the positions of the European groups in the Parliament will be informed and inspired by this, and we could understand them as like let's say the maximalist position of each political party before they gather around the table and try to agree on a political majority or other agreements on different policy files. And I think they are, even if they are not binding, it's very important or very useful to look at them because they tell us where the political debate in the EU and particularly in Brussels is going and what the different political families are prioritizing as well. So I had some animations here that I won't be able to play, but basically, there's not always one political party that has the exact equivalent as a political group in the Parliament, but you have inside each of the political groups a leading party. Although sometimes you have more than one. For instance, in the Greens, you have the Pirates, you have the EFA, you have Volt, or within the Liberals, you also have several parties. The Social Democrats, the EPP, and Renew are still likely to be the ones forming a majority after the elections. So it's important to bear this in mind when we look at the different manifestos and which ones might be more relevant in setting the future agenda. But of course, the EPP, together with far-right parties, so ECR and ID, they would be either having also a majority or close to a majority, which means that they could block legislation. They could actually, this would put the EPP in a very comfortable position where basically they can block legislation that they don't like together with the far right. And this puts the EPP as the kingmaker of the next European Parliament. And this is also important to bear in mind because their manifesto is perhaps the one that has the most agenda setting power, let's say. And just a quick example of what this means is, for instance, on the if the vote of on the internal combustion engine would have happened not in the past Parliament but in the future Parliament, according to current projections, this would mean that it would not have passed, and we could expect very similar situations with other environmental legislations. So going already on the analysis, we have looked at all the manifestos, but particularly paying attention to those of the parties that are leading the main political groups. As I was saying, we have, for instance, on the Liberals, also the European Democratic Party or the party of Emmanuel Macron, also very important to look at those differences, but we will mostly be looking at ALDE, which is the main one, and the same with the Greens and ECR. So here I wanted to actually stop for the questions that we had for you, just to see what you what you expect to see in the manifestos, and then I will show you what actually we found. So the first question is, what do you think are the most common priorities across the manifestos? And of course, here we're putting them all at the same level without taking in consideration that some parties are much bigger than others. And then the second question is, who you think, or which political party has this in their manifesto? So they said Europe has a leading role to play in global climate protection. Our hallmark is the European Green Deal. We want to further develop the Green Deal, and without climate protection, our economy cannot remain competitive. So
I'll wait a little bit longer. We're at 50% now. Okay, I'll give people a little bit more time.
cool.
Okay. You get 5 more seconds. Okay.
All right, so I cannot see the percentages. Perhaps
I can help
Susanna,
you out.
you can say, yeah.
Yes, so we had, for the first question, 15% had voted for green transition, social protection and resilience. 41% had voted for economic recovery, migration and climate change, and 44% had voted the last one, security, economic competitiveness and institutional reforms.
So actually that last one was the correct one, as I will show later. And then on the second question, did the participants get it right?
No, you didn't. 60% of you all voted for the Green Party.
So this was a tricky question. It was on purpose. It was a provoking question. It's actually the European People's Party. So this will be one of the main points I perhaps would like to make during the presentation on what we found. And is that, well, you will see, but first of all, I'm going to speak about the general narrative that we saw in the manifestos. And what we saw there is that the approach to the far right seems to be like the main division line, and how political parties relate to each other and position themselves in the campaign. This is particularly true for the parties on the left. And it's also the case of the EPP, but they are having a different approach. Of course, they are opening that door to, like, in an indirect way, to make agreements with the far right, selling themselves as bridge builders, which would allow them to have a lot of bargaining power, as I was saying before, as they have this role of kingmakers in the European Parliament. So that's perhaps the main takeaway from that. Then on the priorities, we already mentioned them. Of course, all the parties touch upon all these topics and also more topics, but these ones seem to stand out as the top priorities for each one of them. And here we have security and defense, economic performance and competitiveness. Also climate and green transition is there, although not for all of them. Social protection and supporting citizens, and in institutional reform. And I also included migration because it's the top priority for ECR and also the other far-right party, although they didn't release a manifesto. So it's likely to also be quite relevant. So now I would like to concretely speak about what we saw regarding climate. And then on the other priorities, perhaps we'll have time to speak about them during the discussion in the second part of the event. But particularly on this, what we see is that climate is actually still on the table, particularly for the parties on the left, but it also remains a standalone policy subchapter for the center-right, so for the EPP. And also relevant to note that for the parties on the left, they completely merged their climate and their social priorities into a single one, which is also an evolution from where they were in like 5 years ago. Also relevant is that the main two parties, the Social Democrats and the EPP, want to further develop the European Green Deal, particularly the industrial and social aspects of it. And then those who wouldn't be that much on board with that idea are, on the one hand, the liberals, which are asking for a pause on new legislation and a focus on just implementing what has already been decided. And then the far right, they are asking also to stop new legislation, to focus on implementation as well. But they also want to review or revert part of the legislation that has been approved. Then also we noticed the main so priorities within climate and environment that were standing out the most for the different parties. And here what we found is that clean technologies, green investments, circular economy, sustainable agriculture as well were some of the most important ones. So together with industrial and social, as I mentioned before, and then particularly on energy, there was a strong focus on reducing dependencies and tackling also energy security. And also perhaps worth mentioning that despite the farmers' protests, making agriculture more sustainable was still quite relevant across the board. So I don't think I will have the time to go into the details of the rest of the analysis, but just for you to know what you can find, and perhaps you can delve deeper later on the content of the slides. You will have tables summarizing the different topics, but we also wanted to look at particularly what do the parties say on security and defense, and what the parties say on economic competitiveness and economic performance, because there were a lot of elements linking to climate, particularly on this one, on economic competitiveness, and it's emerging as one of the areas where we might see climate action, not as for the sake of climate protection, but for the sake of competitiveness. But still, we might see important opportunities there. We also included our takeaways on social protection and supporting citizens, and about investments. But I think, yeah, as I was saying, I think we'll have time to delve deep into that in the second part of the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pepe, for this presentation of the findings, your analysis of the European Party manifestos. Well done on the trick questions. Honestly, I was suspecting that it could be a trick question, but it's still, the wording in the manifesto of the EPP is quite surprising, I have to say, based on the sort of vocabulary that is used. So, but yes, indeed, we will have time to delve into more details on what comes next, I think, in the next section of our webinar. But right now, last but certainly not least, I will turn to Jannik from Europe, who is policy fellow at the Jacques Delors Centre, and who will be presenting a survey on debunking the myth of green backlash. Jannik, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks again also for having me here. I think we gained very interesting insights also by Pepe on the party's priorities on climate policy. My presentation will focus a bit more on what people actually would prefer in this area. As I said, or as you mentioned, we have launched a large-scale survey to look into that. But maybe we also start, as usual, with the question section and raise the polls. So, I mean, I can read it out. The first one is actually, what is the approximate share of respondents in France, indicating that they are already negatively affected by climate change or expect to be so in the next 5 to 10 years? And there we have different percentages. And the second question is, in which of the 3 countries surveyed, which are Germany, Poland, and France, does the majority of respondents still support more ambitious climate policies? Is it France? Is it France and Germany? Is it actually none of the 3, or is it all of the 3?
Give a few seconds for participants to enter. And
3, 2, 1. Okay, end. Okay, and Jannik, I'm guessing you will not see the percent.
I don't see the percent. I only see the correct answers.
Okay, then I will help you out. So the correct answer was 80%, and 37 of the attendees today voted for that. The most of you voted for 50%. And then in the second question, the right answer was all of the 3, and just under half of you voted correctly. 31% of you voted for France and Germany.
Interesting. So now let's maybe start with the presentation, and then we look a little bit more into what is actually behind these numbers. So as we all know, or as we all have followed the discussions, climate policy is again one of the dominating policy debates or policy issues in the election campaigns of the parties. This as such is not completely new. If we look back to the elections in 2019, we can all remember that hundreds of thousands of young people actually took to the streets to protest and demand more ambitious climate policies to secure their future. 5 years later, we again see protests on the streets concerning climate policy. However, the tone has somewhat shifted, as it now is mainly farmers which roll their tractors into European capitals, blocking roads, and actually venting their anger, especially also about environmental regulations. These protests have provided fodder for far-right parties, which have now or increasingly framed climate policies as unfair and overly burdensome, especially to ordinary citizens, and thereby the narrative of a widespread green backlash amongst the electorate against more ambitious climate policies has gained considerable traction. And we also see that this has played out in the parliament as well, where also liberal and conservative politicians have become more hesitant to actually endorse Green Deal initiatives, but rather instead called for a pause of regulation or even a rollback of certain climate legislation. So what we were interested in was actually to see whether this political U-turn is actually truly reflected in what we see in people's preferences on the ground. So what have we done? We teamed up with researchers from the University of Oxford and the Humboldt University in Berlin to launch an online survey asking about 15,000 citizens in France, Poland, and Germany about their climate policy preferences. We have done that at the end of last year, so it was really timely data now to draw some conclusions during the election campaigns. So what have we seen with regard to general support for climate policy, where we have asked citizens to indicate whether they think that politics should do a lot more to combat climate change, which was indicated as a 0 on a scale from 0 to 10, or on the upper side of the scale, whether policies tackling climate change have already gone too far. And what have we seen? I mean, here you can see the results for Germany, and we actually see that there's still a majority of citizens that is in favor of more ambitious climate policy. And this is actually also reflected in the other 2 countries, where we also see that an absolute majority of the citizens is still supporting or still wishes for more ambitious climate policies to take place in the future. This should not disregard the fact that there, of course, is also a sizable minority in these countries. We can see the example of Germany here, where around 31% of our sample has indicated that they are skeptic of more ambitious climate policy. However, and I think that's important to highlight here, this group is largely dominated by supporters of far-right parties, as you see here in the light blue part of the bar, which is showing the supporters of the far-right AfD in Germany. Also important is that if we compare our results to the survey results of previous surveys, which have asked a very similar question, we don't see this significant increase of this group of climate opponents or climate skeptics. Moving on, I think abstract support is of course very important, but a lot of would argue that it's more important that actually this abstract support also translate into support for concrete climate policies. So we actually have asked citizens about their stance on 40 different climate policies, and no worries, I will not go into the details of this graph here. And this is just to give you a first glimpse of it. The dashed line is actually the baseline, indicating a scenario in which no further policies than in the status quo would be decided. So all dots on the right side or in the upper right quadrant indicate policies which would be preferred towards sticking towards this status quo. And what we see is there's actually a broad range of policies that would be preferred. This is Germany. We see a similar picture in Poland, and in France, there's even a broader range of policies that would be supported. So this actually is a clear indicator also supporting what we have found beforehand, but we don't see this general backlash actually amongst the electorate. But it also shows us, as we have asked, as our 40 concrete policies have included different types of industries, we can also make some first or get some first insights about people's preference for different instruments. So we can clearly see that there is a wish for a stronger focus on green industrial policies, on investments into green infrastructure, such as the expansion of electricity grids or railway systems. We also see that targeted regulatory measures, such as standards for the industry or the power sector, are still very popular. But on the other hand of the spectrum, we see that broad bans and CO2 pricing mechanisms, especially in areas such as heating or transport, which are likely to impose more direct effects on citizens, are relatively unpopular when we compare it amongst those policies that we listed here. While I said that the ranking in general is relatively or actually remarkable comparable across countries, we see some differences between different parties or across party lines. So these are the results for green and left-leaning parties in Germany, and we can see, given that almost all the dots are on the right side of the dashed vertical line, that both citizens would actually support almost any the implementation of almost any climate policy towards sticking towards the status quo. If we then look at the other end of this political spectrum, investigating policy preferences of AfD voters, we see that these voters would hardly support the implementation of any climate policy, only except from a few, which mainly concern investments into green infrastructure, such as electricity grids or railway systems. And I think for moving forward and building broader climate coalitions, it will also be important to look here more into this pivotal middle of the political spectrum, namely the supporters of liberal and center-right parties. And here we see a more differentiated picture. So we see that actually there's still a broad range of policies which are preferred towards the status quo, but it will matter how these policies are mixed and which policies are selected, as other policies such as CO2 pricing or broader bans are not very favored amongst both groups. This was the choice of policies, and what we have seen is also that policymakers are likely to face a bit of a political dilemma here, because those policies which are very popular tend also to be more costly, while those which are more efficient and necessary to reach climate goals, such as CO2 pricing, are relatively unpopular. So how can we actually increase the popularity of such policies? By designing them in different ways. And so with regard to the financing of popular policies, we see that general tax increases are relatively unpopular, but there might be room for political compromise when we look at a combination, for example, of a reprioritization of existing resources from other areas and the take-up of higher debt, which is especially favored by left-leaning voters in Germany. If we come then to the design of unpopular policies such as CO2 pricing, we see that actually there's a strong agreement across party lines and across countries that these CO2 pricing mechanisms should be combined with a form of compensation. And what we clearly see as well is that a progressive redistribution of the revenues, so the disbursement of money to all households, but with a focus or a privileged amount of revenues going towards those households that are especially vulnerable towards the CO2 pricing mechanism. So there we can see a clear indication for a wish towards more just transition in that regard. And at the end, I also want to look a little bit ahead. If we, at the European level, because that's what we are talking about, we have seen long debates about enhanced investment at the European stage. And if we ask citizens about it, we actually find, or we can be cautiously optimistic there, because also liberal and conservative citizens would actually be willing to support such an instrument if it serves also other policy priorities. And I think that's important to say here, that framing also matters for those citizens. So they would be willing to support such an instrument if it also focuses or serves priorities such as enhancing economic security or fostering convergence among member states. So let's wrap it up with the main takeaways for the European elections. I think other than our media reports nowadays indicate, we don't see actually this broad green backlash amongst citizens in Europe against more ambitious climate policy. What we see is, though, that choice and design of policies matters a lot, and it especially matters to pivotal voters in the middle of the political spectrum, which will be important moving forward and keeping alive the climate consensus. And it will also matter how parties position themselves during the election campaigns. We have seen that partisanship and ideology impact people's climate policy preferences to a large extent. So if mainstream parties decide to compete over recipes how to move forward and develop further Europe's climate policy mix, people will actually notice. But if conservative, especially conservative and liberal parties move forward with proposing a pause on climate legislation, portraying it as overly burdensome in general manners, then this could actually fabricate the very climate fatigue that they are trying to cater to by doing so. And what are the main policy takeaways? I think it is clear that looking forward, citizens wish for a stronger focus on green industrial and investment policies. This, of course, comes with critical financing questions, but which are not unsolvable. And we also see strong emphasis on realizing a just transition, especially with regard to compensating higher prices or the higher impact of CO2 pricing on more vulnerable households. This is just a glimpse. You can read more about it in our policy brief, which is available at our website. And we also have an interactive online dashboard. So you can actually filter through the different questions and look into policy preferences of different subgroups as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jannik. And so just to confirm for all of your statistician aficionados here today that we have dashboards, we have color-coded selections, we have all of this information online of the respective organizations present today. Thank you all very much for your presentations of the tools that are at our disposal to analyze, let's say, the situation as we are today and trying to make projections as to how this could impact and how we could envisage the new election, the new European legislator after this election cycle. The idea would be now to dive into more of an interactive sort of a Q&A section for yet another 50 minutes. We're almost on time, let's say 10 minutes late. I'll take that. So once again, to remind participants that please, if you have any question, any burning questions or any kind, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom window. Please identify yourself, and by that I mean name and organization, as you would do in taking the floor in a normal in-person sort of meeting. And don't hesitate to ask your questions to all speakers or to indicate to whom you would like to dedicate your question. Again, as usual in in-person meeting. But to launch a bit, to kickstart the conversation, I wanted to ask all of you for your feeling at the moment, one in turn. So as the same order as you made your presentation. So back to you, Joe, in the at first. I wanted to ask you, what do you expect will be the main, now that we've had all of these tools to evaluate the situation and analyze the situation, what do you think will be the main narrative to dominate the political debate up until the election and in the first months, before we have the College of Commissioners, before we have all of these legislators ironed out? What's the main narrative that's likely to be carried away? And what are the positive, the negative, but also the positive signals of that what we could expect from this new legislator on environmental policy? So,
thanks, Antoine, for the question. And I think maybe from my perspective, it might be a little bit more on what kind of narrative we will put forward, actually, as civil society. Then I'm interested to hear from others about their analysis of, what's likely or not. And I think, that question you asked us about the resilience of the Green Deal, I think is going to be really key, because this is a framework. It's something that it looks at the long term, it goes across sectors. It touches on not just climate action, but really across all the different key areas of environmental action. We've not talked so much about nature and pollution as well so far, and I think that keeping that kind of sustained ambition and not stepping back from Europe's responsibilities. I think as a civil society network, actually, the study that Jannik presented on debunking the green backlash has been discussed pretty widely, and actually something that reflects what a lot of us also see. And I think I'm fascinated by this concept of the fabrication of fatigue, because I think it is important to ask, when we talk about fatigue, regulatory fatigue, or who is tired and why. And I think we've also not spoken so much about the various kind of vested interests that also come into play, certainly when it comes to nature, agriculture as well. So I think that keeping this kind of narrative of sustained action will be really important, over the next weeks, but also in the post-election phase, as we try to make sense of the results. And maybe one final, remark on that I would make is that we'll see what the results will be. I mean, there's still some time to go. And I think that we've seen in previous elections that polls are indicators. They are by no means forecasts. And it's very hard to say exactly what the results will be. Our role as civil society is to continue to push until the final votes are cast. And I think that's everyone's responsibility. But I would be interested to hear also reflections from the audience and from other panelists about perception and reality being a little bit different in terms of, you've asked experts as part of the Barometer, and the Jacques Delors Centre has asked voters about, their appetite perhaps for further action and ambition. And you found in the Jacques Delors study that, there was actually potentially more than you might assume from the kind of narratives in the media debates. The question I would have is about the perception that people have of everyone else. So I think you will often see that people will say, well, I believe that there should be further climate action, but I'm in a minority and most people don't agree with me. when that might not actually be the case. And I think that's something where we will try to articulate this kind of inclusive vision of how there's so much that citizens have to gain from the transition actually, and that more of their fellow citizens might be in favor of this action than they might assume from media coverage, for example.
Thanks a lot, Jo, and I tend to agree, of course. I mean, this sort of narrative around the regulatory fatigue, around the sort of a green backlash, is something that we've been hearing for some months now in the European, what we call the European bubble here in Brussels. But that's what it is. Also, it's a bubble, and it might not reflect the actual reality of the how citizens feel throughout Europe, and what might actually be that might translate into their votes. So we have to take these notions with a pinch of salt. And this is why this research on what actually happens on the ground with citizens and how climate and environmental policies are envisaged that actually matter at the end of the day. Pepe, perhaps on this kind of a positive and negative messaging that you see after the EU elections, what would you think?
Yeah, I also wanted to comment on the narrative that we can expect, and also looking at how the different parties position themselves in the manifestos. I would say that we will have a lot of discussions on the approach to the far right, which agreements are acceptable, how much influence the different parties allow the far right to have. This is also what we are starting to see already in the campaign, and I think it will be even more intense as we discuss also who supports the next commission president, but also we're likely to see some commissioners coming from the ECR party. So this will be pretty much on the agenda. And here I agree very much with what Jo was saying. It's also important which story we are going to tell ourselves. And also, yeah, we need to show how, despite the far right making some gains, probably in the elections, a majority of Europeans still voted for those who allegedly want to continue with the green transition, and that majority should be respected as well. So we shouldn't fall in that far right narrative as if it's representative of everyone, and we should try to and now go into this positive signs, try to promote them, to give them visibility, to amplify them, and to try to harness them, because yes, we see that at least in the parties' lines, the commitment to EU climate action is more resilient than one could at first glance imagine. The main parties want to continue developing the EU Green Deal. We see that agriculture, green investments, just transition, industrial policy, all this is gonna continue on the table, wrapped in a way or another. We also see enough alignment among the mainstream parties, which suggests that centrist majority is the most likely option, and we should also aim for something like that. Of course, there will be difficulties with Social Democrats and Renew pulling in different directions, for instance, on investment or social issues. Also, of course, we shouldn't forget the role that the EPP might play if they flirt with the far right. But this centrist political majority is the most likely scenario, and that's something positive that we should push for. And again, the prominence of climate change and the green transition also in discussions about other emerging topics such as economic competitiveness or social support, how we prioritize that people are going to be supported in the transition. And also even for security, although we tend to see a lot, well, mainly the discourse is focused on defense and military. We also see a lot of fertile ground for a broader notion of security that can avoid those trade-offs, like when they speak about energy security or about tackling dependencies, resilience, etc. So, yeah, let's focus on these positive aspects. Also, I forgot to mention that parties, when they speak about investments, there's agreement that they want to prioritize them for green, for the green transition. So yeah, let's try to harness all this rather than falling into a pessimistic view.
Thanks a lot, Pepe. And I take note of your last point, and I'll get back also to Jannik on that at some point during the conversation on the finances, the investment, the actual where's the money coming from to finance this transition? Because I think this eventually at the heart of a lot of considerations and worries expressed by citizens across Europe for some time now. Irene, perhaps how do you feel about this future narrative and future policy priorities as we asked the experts actually to tell us?
Yeah, well, from the talks that the head of state and government are currently having and the leaks of the strategic agenda, it really seems that industrial policies and increasing EU competitiveness will be central in the next mandate as a way for the EU to be able to participate in the run for new technologies with countries such as China and the US. What is hoped, however, is that climate action will not just be put aside completely, but that this new European industrial grill that we have heard about will be complementing the European Green Deal, and that their objectives will be delivered hand in hand. Having the industry sector on board during the transition is, of course, it's a good thing. We can boost innovation and create new green jobs. However, yes, it is hoped that it will not undermine the path towards climate neutrality and towards a circular economy. The Green Deal has actually demonstrated to be flexible and to be able also to adapt to different contexts, as it happened, for example, during when the war in Ukraine broke out, where all the focus went to the energy transition and the boost of renewables. So also for this next phase, it should be treated like a flexible tool. In this survey, in the Barometer, we did ask experts about their beliefs on the future priorities, and also what is needed from a scientific perspective to reach the climate objectives that are legally binding. So it's not something that we can just ignore. And they, most of them agreed on the fact to increase action on certain areas that were overlooked so far, namely sustainable food and farming systems, increase in action in the biodiversity area, but while adopting more measures to ensure a just transition and the social aspects that we have seen also for example, in the manifesto analysis, and also as a way to increase support at national level.
Thanks a lot, Irene. And your point actually echoes some of a question that we've just had in the chat from Alice from EAZA on the considerations on environmental issues beyond climates, and on especially when we talk about biodiversity, when we talk about nature, when we talk about pollution. I mean, we're talking here of a triple planetary crisis, and some aspects tend to perhaps have more political kind of wind behind them rather more than others. So we'll probably get back to all of you on that as to how to consider these nature-related issues, pollution-related issues into the debate. But before doing that, Jannik, the same question as I've asked the others about the potential future narrative and the potential future positive and negative points that we can expect from the next EU legislator. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually agree with a lot what Irene just said. I think it is relatively clear that we will see a continued push for more or stronger emphasis on industry, on the economy, especially from the EPP, from the right side, from the liberals. And I think there it depends how we strike the balance. You know, I think like the framing as such might be actually helpful to actually win over some of the citizens on the right side of the political aisle. However, if it's then only playing out as blindly slashing environmental standards and cutting red tape, of course, there one needs to be careful, and one really needs to ensure that while we cut red tape where it is necessary and make processes easier, we still we still commit to the goals that we have already established, and that we accelerate action to reach them. Because I think it's clear still a lot needs to be done. And you rightfully mentioned already that the lack in financial resources to achieve a lot of those goals, and we will need public investments to also unlock a lot of the private investment in that sense, will be necessary. And I think the negotiations on the upcoming budget, on the next budget, will be a critical momentum for that, to actually really push there for a stronger leg for common EU investment in the green sector, but also establishing strong standards when it comes to realizing a just transition. And I think that's also important for the agriculture sector, where we see some concerns, which I don't want to dismiss, because I think a lot of those small and medium-sized farms actually are actually confronted with a lot of bureaucracy there, which might be difficult for them to handle. So actually we need a very differentiated approach here, which makes it easier for those, while still helping them to transition their businesses, and imposing relatively stricter standards on larger size farm enterprises here.
Indeed. Thanks a lot, Jannik. Joe, a quick question for you on this sort of making sure that the narrative around nature, biodiversity, pollution stays on top of the agenda and not being forgotten behind climate, innovation, competitiveness sort of considerations. From a civil society organization perspective, how do you envisage to try and make sure that this message is still heard and carried?
It's a really good question, and it's really topical. I think after the farmers' protests of recent months, it's been on a lot of people's minds. I mean, I'd say from our perspective as Climate Action Network Europe, one of the ideas actually behind forming this alliance of other environmental NGO networks to work on this election year was indeed to kind of put the pieces together. So in our advocacy, we would be more effective and more kind of joined up, thinking exactly about, you know, the really important role of nature in tackling the climate crisis, and how, you know, these interconnections are actually, if they're not addressed, you know, together, then we can't meet the climate objectives that we have. So I'd say that this is something that, whether it's on the nature restoration law or on agriculture, you know, it's something that we aim to do. I mean, as Can Europe, we don't work on agriculture and specifically on CAP and these kind of crucial questions, and I leave that to colleagues to answer about. But I think, I mean, it is clear that on ensuring that, you know, farmers have a fair income, there are some key things that need to happen in the next mandate. And I think that unfortunately these situations, whether it's the protests or the narratives around them in the media, can sometimes be used and instrumentalized, you know, to suit a particular agenda around the future of agriculture, where, you know, we know that we need to see, in line with our climate objectives, we need to shift away from industrial agriculture, industrial livestock, and we need to have this agroecological transition, and we need to bring farmers along with us in that. It needs to be a fair transition where you know, they receive a fair wage, and that, you know, the same can be said across many different sectors. So I think maybe that kind of emphasis on the just transition is something that will be even more important, and I think you've seen that reflected in the presentations from other speakers. Ultimately, because, you know, as well as the fairness aspect, policies that are designed without fairness, you know, in the understanding of how they will be implemented are doomed to fail, right? So they need, in order to be effective, they also they need to be designed in a fair way.
Thanks a lot. And yes, indeed, making sure that all communities, especially those that are most adversely impacted, stays on board and can be demonstrated that they are supported through this transition is key to make the message consistent. So Pepe and Jannik, turning to you now, in your analysis, we think we all agree that the just transition needs a fair amount of financing. In your analysis of the manifesto or others or what's happening at the ground, where where does the money come from, essentially? How does the party promote this financial input that would, or actually allocate the financial input that are needed for this transition?
Perhaps if I can come first. So actually, this is perhaps one of the takeaways as well of our analysis, that we predict this to be one of the main battlefields after the EU elections, because of course all parties, well, the positive side is that when they speak about prioritizing investments, they say the green transition among those, but also defense, and then also the social issues. And we have a lot of competing priorities. And as you were saying, the question is, how are we going to have enough money to cover all those priorities that we're going to have on the table? We have the RRF coming to an end. We have the fiscal rules that are limiting the spending capacity of member states. So, and then we also have, when we look at the positions of different parties, for instance, the liberals rather on the austerity side. So the liberals say that investments are key, but then they say that we should just reprioritize existing funds and facilities and facilitate the access to them, but they explicitly refuse having new investments or new instruments. And so what I think it's important here is, I think we're going to see a lot of developments from now until the next multi-annual financial framework, so the EU budget. And we might see some shifts happening also within the political families, because we already see that actually within the liberals, we have different opinions. For instance, the party of Emmanuel Macron released also sort of manifesto of what they want and for the next mandate, and they didn't really agree on this with their main partner, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, and they say we actually need more, not only private but also more public investments. And also the European Democratic Party, which is also part of this liberal group in the parliament of Renew, they said we do need more investments, not only reprioritizing them. We need the EU to have more own resources from sources such as the CBAM, but we also need to make the RRF permanent. So I think this will be the key in the coming, like in the first year after the elections, I would say.
Thanks a lot, Pepe. And very interesting to hear about these internal debates on the opportunity to leverage public financing and public funding to eventually to secure or to engage in the just transition. Arguably, these past few years, you mentioned the RFF, we mentioned also the REPowerEU and the impact that it had on the EU energy project, let's say, could also be a consideration in the balance. But interesting to hear that even among political groups at the European Parliament, there are these debates happening. Jannik, what do you think about what does your analysis say exactly?
I mean, looking at the results of our survey, I think it's relatively clear when it comes, for example, to carbon pricing, and we will see the introduction of ETS2 in politically sensitive areas such as heating and transport. And I think our analysis clearly indicates that it will be crucial here to implement or to compensate households, especially households that are vulnerable to higher prices in both areas. We have the social climate fund in that sense, and we will see how the development of the social climate plans will work out. But I think it's also relatively fair to say already that the amount dedicated right now will not be sufficient to actually compensate households adequately, and to also enable especially low to medium households to actually make investments which will allow them to avoid higher prices, to buy an EV, install solar panels or heat pumps. These are costly investments, So they will actually need to be subsidized to some extent. And I think there it will really come also to national governments and how they actually top up the money that is dedicated to these social purposes here. And that will play a crucial role. And I think more in general, when we talk about just transition of former fossil fuel communities in Europe, I think one can again see the negotiations on the upcoming budget as one point where this could be addressed. I think there are a lot of rumors how cohesion money could be used differently, and I think there is some room to align objectives here, to also set some standards when it comes to the transition, or make sure that money spent is also helping these regions to transition. And there it will also not only be important from the financial side, but it will also be important to involve also local stakeholders, social partners, to also work out agreements together with these communities to actually promote and convince them on a viable way forward, which includes also the transitioning of former fossil fuel workers especially into clean tech sectors, for example, as we see a lot of skill overlap in that sense, and we see that we already facing a shortage in both segments already.
Indeed, and this use of the fund of the ETS kind of ticks both boxes that we were discussing before. I mean, we will leverage more public and private financing through the extension of the ETS to new sectors, including some politically sensitive one. But then is a question of repurposing these funds, or purposing actually these funds adequately to make sure that we can make them a social tool for transformation. So indeed, that's a very important part of the topic. You've mentioned standards and sustainability standards and the kind of elevation of upscaling and upskilling the EU industrial base. This is what the EU has been doing for the past years with CBAM and the like. But it also clear that these policies have had an external impact. And there I would like to turn back to Irene, perhaps looking at the external impact of the European Green Deal. Because of course, up until now, it was a bit too easy. So now we have to look at the impact that these policies, as these just transition policies, have beyond our borders. So Irene, could you expand a little bit on the external impact of the European Green Deal as it appears, as it's considered by experts beyond EU borders?
Yeah, well, as highlighted in the Barometer's report, among the sustainability experts from outside the EU, there is a very positive perception on the Green Deal's efficacy in both delivering international targets for the EU and inspiring other countries to act in this sense. Therefore, yeah, we cannot make prediction on how the new commission will look like, although we can rely on the polls. But nevertheless, it's extremely important that the EU will keep such ambitions high, also in face of what could happen in other countries. And I'm referring to the fact that in many countries around the world, there will be elections that can also turn to a more a more negative scenario concerning the climate path. For example, in the US, we all know that we might see Trump coming back to the presidency and overturning the current administration's decarbonization strategies, which, on the other hand, would turn into a negative influence for other countries around the world, and would even more undermine the achievement of the Paris targets, for example. So it is really of utmost importance that the EU shows great leadership and cohesive position on this, and also in the manifestos for example, the EPP, maybe usually not considered the most ambitious for climate policy, but the climate fight that the EU is carrying out is a way to establish the EU as a leader in the world in this fight. So yes, what is hoped is that the EU will still keep these high ambitions for the next phase.
The so-called impact of the Brussels effect has been debated for a while now. Thanks very much, Irene. At this stage, we have like 15-20 minutes before the end of this webinar. I wanted to give participants, all participants, the chance to intervene directly if they wish to do so. So please, by all means, will raise your hand and we can unmute you if you would like to intervene in the debate or ask questions to one of the presenters. Again, if I can ask you to introduce yourself and your organization before asking your question. And I would like to start by asking Antoine Bier, who has the question in writing, which I'm not exactly sure I fully understand. On financing the transition being essential to make it happen, how could you demonstrate it is achievable if retained as a top priority? I think you meant by that asking us or asking research organizations to demonstrate that it is feasible in order to make sure that actually policymakers will keep it on the agenda, because that's what they are actually working on. That's the real world, they would say. But that's how I understand. That's how I understand it. I see you specified your question. Could you develop an approach to prove that allocating capital to the transition will have one of the highest side benefit on other objective? Well, that's a tough question. Do I want to, Joe, you have your hand raised. Is it to get on that point specifically?
It's to make an attempt, because it is a tough question.
It's a tough one, but go ahead, please.
Let's see. I mean, I think one relevant piece of research that we can share from the side of Can Europe is on the socioeconomic co-benefits of accelerated climate action. So this is not only about the cost of inaction, which I think is always underestimated completely in these conversations. I mean, there are huge costs that are coming our way in the case of less ambitious scenarios. And I think you only need to take a look at the European Environment Agency's climate risk assessment for Europe, which came out recently, which is really sobering actually on some of the potential costs that are coming our way if we fail to adapt, but if we fail to mitigate. So I think that's the framing that we would bring. But in fact, I mean, the calculations that we made as Can Europe on the co-benefits of climate action, it's €1 trillion by 2030, per year. It's really vast actually across the economy and across sectors and across health, really very kind of tangible benefits for citizens. And I think that says something also about the narratives we use in terms of the narrative of what citizens have to gain from the transition, basically, rather than focusing on certain questions where it's more sensitive in terms of the challenges for the cost of living. And that's the point I would make actually on investment and on the future MFF, and also what we call for, in addition to an MFF, which is a strong budget, basically, where we have also at least half of that new MFF going towards climate and nature-related investment, that we also have this new, social, green, however you want to frame it, this new investment plan that actually comes from direct borrowing from the Commission. That's something that we call for, and as Alliance, so not just CAN, but also WWF, Transport Environment, the EEB, and BirdLife. And because we've seen, what that can do in the last years of crisis, and we know that need is only going to be sustained. So I don't know if it answers Antoine's questions about feasibility, because I think you're maybe talking about political feasibility and how do we sell this politically, and that's a big open question that I think we will have to reflect on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and indeed, this is, as you pointed out, to sell this, to demonstrate the economic benefits of the transition, to make it more palatable for policymakers. This is what it is. I know I'm a moderator, and I'm not supposed to actually intervene in the debate, but I'd like also to point to a paper that IEEP has published last year on the economic benefits of nature-based solution, and in particular on this idea that €1 invested in nature restoration activities could have a potential €8 in return. So these are all part of the picture that makes the just transition not just a principled way forward, but an economically benefiting one as well. We have Hero, who is from the participants, who is raising his hand. Mattia, can we unmute? Yes, Hero, you have the floor. You've been muted again, Mattia.
Does it work now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thanks, first of all, to all speakers for your interesting interventions. I wanted to come back to the question related to the Green Deal and its impacts on the Global South. Because I recall about a year ago, I read an article referring to a business leader in one of the developing countries blaming the EU for neo-colonialistic approach. And he was referring to the tighter legislation introduced through the Green Deal, meaning that whenever exporters from the Global South wanted to enter the internal market, they would now face ever tighter regulations regarding their products. So my question to you is, how would you suggest to tackle that problem? Because obviously that is a challenge that many of these countries are facing. And thereby, do you see a possibility in the EU providing technical assistance in view of this new legislative package that we have introduced during the past 4 years? Or would you rather see some kind of financial support as an alternative? Thank you.
Thank you, Hero. And again, you put me in a difficult situation here because I was working on the topic and actually produced a report specifically on the matter. So unless, Irene, you'd like, as the IEP speaker of today, if you'd like to have a go at the answer, otherwise I can certainly address the topic.
Well, I can say a few words, perhaps. But yes, a question that we asked to the expert was if they consider the process, the legislative process in terms of, with regard to the Green Deal policies that have an external impact, whether it's closed or open. And I think a majority of respondents consider it to be rather a closed process. So one way to avoid that third countries bear only the burden is to include more them in the process since the beginning, and yeah, make an impact assessment on the social and the costs that they will have to bear, in particular small companies that maybe rely a lot on that are particularly affected by this kind of policies. If anyone else wants to complement, I'm happy to give the floor.
Thanks a lot, Irene. And indeed, the capacity for the EU to reach out to external partners and actually continue them into the decision-making process or into its trade and cooperation negotiations actually is also very debated, a very debated topic that fuels concerns for sure, and especially on the current geopolitical scene. Okay. We have a follow-up question from Antoine, based on thanking Joe for your answer. And going forward, how to substantiate the debate and progress in funds allocation policies toward green investment? That's also the point of one of my questions earlier. Not the easiest one. So if you, Joe, or any other speaker want to have to give it 2 cents as quickly as possible, please, because then we'll be reaching the end of the webinar.
Yes, thanks, Antoine. So I can share, or maybe an IEP colleague can share the statement that we released just last week as a coalition. on this green and social investment plan, because there we substantiate some of the kind of more specific asks that we have. But I think, more broadly, this is something where it relates to what Jannik was saying earlier about framing this, right, in a way that is, appealing, and in a way that links into other priorities. So whether it's on security, or whether it's about getting rid of our dependency on fossil fuels and our, increasing our resilience. Competitive sustainability is something that's talked about a lot. These are some of the kind of narratives that we want to bring the finance and investment package that we're calling for. But I mean, ultimately, we also have to be quite clear, right? Which is that we will not meet our policy objectives without this finance, because there is a huge funding gap that exists. We talked a lot about climate, but also on biodiversity. So to achieve the 2030 biodiversity strategy, there's a 19 billion euro per year gap, from 2021 to 2030 that we're in the midst of. So I think that also requires a deal of honesty with policymakers about how unlikely it is that we will meet our targets if we don't have this kind of finance.
Thanks a lot, Joe, for this. Okay, we have a few minutes left. So if I could ask each and every one of you for some concluding remarks, essentially the main recommendation, the main message that you would like all participants to get home with, stemming from your latest research, and how do you envisage this will actually impact the EU legislation or policymaking process moving forward? Who would you like to say? Let's go backward this time. Perhaps Jannik to start, and we end up with Joe.
Yeah, thank you. I think our message is relatively clear. I mean, what we have found in our data is actually simply the fact that the narrative of a general green backlash in the EU is largely overstated. And I think this is something that really needs to be put across as a message in order to influence also the future legislative turn and the policy priorities during that term. However, I think it's also important to acknowledge that the choice of policies and the mix of policies included in the future EU policy climate mix will be crucial, and it will also be crucial to keep that broad climate consensus alive. And what we have clearly seen there is that voters have two main priorities based on our findings, and one is that policymakers answer the admittedly difficult question of financing a lot of those green investments, and that more emphasis is put on realizing a just transition and actually reassuring also more vulnerable citizens and households, as well as farmers and enterprises, that the costs and benefits of the transition are fairly distributed. I think that's important. Exactly. And then I think policymakers should put that rather in their contest of ideas during election campaigns, rather than calling for a mere pause on climate legislation.
Thank you very much, Jannik. Pepe, perhaps?
Yeah, so trying to follow also that positive message, and it's kind of what I already said before, but I think it's the main takeaway also from our analysis is that it's easy to fall in a pessimistic spiral and thinking everything is falling apart, but we do have agency as well, and we need to also think of the importance of the message that we're going to give internationally with the European elections and the continuity of the European Green Deal. So if we ourselves fall in this idea that the European Green Deal is over, then we kind of contribute to a self-fulfilled prophecy. So let's try to harness those positive signals that we have on the table. Let's acknowledge that the European Green Deal has been resilient through COVID, has been resilient through the war in Ukraine, and now it also seems to be resilient despite the farmers' protests. And yes, we can recognize other priorities have emerged, but climate change and the green transition are still very prominent in how the parties see how to tackle those other issues, such as economic competitiveness. So also the same with investments. Yes, we see a lot of difficulties. It's going to be an uphill battle, but there is some fertile ground when it comes to prioritizing investments for the green transition, and more actors are aligning and calling for increasing investment capacities and giving more resources to this. So let's not give up. Let's work to give as much space as possible to all those positive signals, and let's start by making sure that we shape the narrative of how the results of the elections will be interpreted as a message from EU citizens calling to a continuation of the EU climate agenda and the green transition.
Thank you very much. Irene?
Yeah, so my final message is very in line with what Pepe said. So although the upcoming new elections are considered to negatively impact the continuation of the Green Deal, there is still belief by experts that the EU institution will turn the ambitions of the Green Deal into law. And there's also a willingness by citizens to continue the fight against climate change at institutional level. And that even with new established priorities, such as in the case defense, industrial policies, climate action has to be seen as a complementary and not just to be put aside in favor of other priorities.
Thank you very much, Irene. And last but not least, Joe, final word.
Well, I will try to keep the more optimistic tone with these final days before votes begin. I mean, you heard from Irene earlier actually about the results of the Barometer in the perception of what kind of actor is most responsible for driving forward the European Green Deal, and its civil society organizations. And I would even extend that kind of more broadly to, you heard from Jannik as well. 5 years ago, there were marches on the streets. There was a real kind of tailwind of broad public action and support for what became the European Green Deal. And I think that that's still there. I think that, Europe's been through incredible crises since 2019 that have really scrambled, so many different areas of public policy. But there's a sustained appetite for climate action among citizens. And I think that civil society organizations play a really important role in bringing this message to policymakers and also in, asserting some pressure, because ultimately we know that MEPs will not act as the heroes we need them to be, and they will perhaps tend back towards their procrastinator habits unless they feel public pressure. And that's why the elections are so important. And I mean, the hashtags we're using for the elections, Vote Future EU, and We Make the Future, because ultimately this is about a livable future and a future of the green transition where people are also at the center of it. So it's important for the planet, for the environmental objectives we've talked about, but where the social dimension is really at the heart. That's my final takeaway.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much, everyone. And I think as a concluding word, I would like to echo what you've just said, that at the end of the day, elections are important. So whatever, irrelevant of your political preference, please do use these tools that have been made put at your disposal to actually make an informed decisions. And don't hesitate to go to vote. The more voting, the better turnout, the more legitimate the EU institutions will be, the better it will be, the easier it will be to do sound decision making. And at the end of the day, this is how it will positively impact, I think, our common future and the achievement of our common objectives. So thank you very much all. It's been a pleasure to host and moderate you this afternoon. We will be in touch with all of the materials that has been shared today, as I've said before. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.